This is Simply Lovaii, and you're listening to the expert with a heart.
And just like that, we've arrived at the concluding episode of our series on financial transition. Welcome back to Simply Lovaii, everybody. I'm Mahalya, your host, and joining me once again are the expert with a heart, Lovaii Navlakhi, CEO and MD of International Money Matters Private Limited, and Susan Bradley, CFP, CEFT, and the founder of the Sudden Money Institute. Thank you so much for being here for the concluding podcast, Lovaii. Susan?
Thanks for having us.
And thank you, but we're already at the end. Okay.
We're already at the end. You know, they say time really does fly, and I've been experiencing that a lot more in the past couple of years, especially after COVID. But to talk about that, serendipitously brought up COVID just now. We've been talking a whole lot, Lovaii, Susan, about the idea of planning for the future, right? But an important thing that has also come out with regards to transition is the idea that you can't plan for everything and you have to allow for uncertainty. And there is a lot of value sometimes in embracing that change and accepting that it is a part of life. We spoke on the previous podcast about retirement and all that brings in terms of a transition. That also throws up a couple of unexpected, situations your way. But one thing that people cannot ever really plan for is the loss of a loved one, right? And that drastically changes life. It changes every aspect of, the way that you approach life, your finances, every single thing. So let's talk about that on today's podcast, how one approaches the loss of a loved one. And as a financial transitionist, how you can help a client through that. I think your insights will be very useful. So to start us off, what is, this is an important one and it's a tricky one, right? But what is the right time to talk about finances? I assume you wait for the client to come to you, but is that always the case? Am I wrong there?
I think finances are always present. Whether they're important or not is determined by the situation. And when you think about the loss of a loved one, it could be a parent, it could be a child, it could be a spouse, it could be someone who had been ill, so there was some anticipation, or it may have been an accident that just changes everything in a flash. So it is situational. In the beginning, we really want to know how someone is. Tell me what's happening. Tell me how you're feeling now. Tell me your story. Just listen in the beginning. But frequently, it's, Lovaii, you probably had this happen too. It may be someone that you know directly or indirectly. It's not a client. It's just someone who has had a loss. And in that case, we don't really ask people about their money. That's not appropriate to do. But you want to make sure that somebody is financially okay to go through the grieving process. So I wouldn't ask someone who wasn't a client about the money, but I would check in with their other people to make sure that they know that they're okay. You need to have some safe time where bills can get paid and the house can stay where it is so that someone can grieve. Beyond that, in the very beginning, you, as a financial transitionist, you also have the financial planning requirements. When someone comes in, you need to know what the assets are. You need to know what the major or the fixed expenses are. So some of that, people don't always have the capacity to answer those questions in the beginning.
Yeah, I think the training that we get makes us wear the hat of a human being first and a financial planner second, I think, in many ways. So the moment you put on that hat, the pace of your questions or what your questions are or your curiosity or inquisitiveness, it sort of drops, right? You are really asking them how they are feeling and whether they are okay to talk about that feeling at this point at all, right? If they're not willing to, you say, okay, we'll come back later. It's not a tick box item that, I went and I was there at the condolence and I did it. So it's very different is what I would think. And I think that obviously you have to take into account the fact that there's an emotional angle. But as we've realized is that sometimes there is certain things that have to be done, whether there is emotion or not. And for example, let's say there is income tax return due date is, day after tomorrow, and somebody has suddenly passed and they have not filed that return. So at least they should be aware that if at all they have to do one thing, then that's what they need to do. And is it easy, not easy? Okay, you can decide that, no, it's not possible. But at least you know that this is the priority item. Everything else can wait.
And, how do you know that? How do you know that they haven't filed? You don't know unless
they have your client and you are aware about it.
Right, then that might be.
Yeah.
I think that because people avoid talking about the money sometimes, they miss. And so the individual is left on their own, kind of spinning through the numbness of the experience. There was an article written by a New York Times journalist. She titled it "No Husband, No Friends." And she wrote about her experience of losing her husband. And because people thought that she was very smart and accomplished woman, they weren't giving her any advice. They weren't talking about the money and all. She sold their house, gave away his things fairly quickly, well within the first year, moved herself into a condo that she ended up calling the prison. And she said everything that she gave away, or many things that she gave away, she missed dearly. She wished she had kept them. She wished she had had the house. But people were treating her with respect because of her capacity professionally, and they weren't giving her advice. So 2 years later, she looked back and she basically wrote this article saying, "What have I done to my life?" It was very revealing. That was several years ago, but I've seen that kind of thing play out where people assume someone is giving advice and they're not really tapped in.
And I think this is really the essence of the financial transitionist offering, that we have to make sure that we keep the client in the safe space. And one of the things that you tend to think when events like these happen is that you are all alone. This has happened only to you, and why me, and all of that. And otherwise I have that image, like you're mentioning about this lady. I have this image to live up to. So I can't go and show my vulnerability to someone else. And no one's asking me for it because, this person is of this status. So I think those sort of barriers get built, and we are trained to actually hopefully break through those and talk to the person as a human being rather than, this is an ex-CEO, ex-director, ex-actor, whatever that is.
I was talking to a man who lost his wife, and he was in his 80s. He was expected to go first. He wasn't prepared to be on his own. And someone had taught him to say, when someone would say, "Are you going to sell this?" or what are you going to do now? Or whatever the question. His answer was, "It's too soon." And that gave him a lot of space. So he eliminated a lot of confusing advice that people wanted to give him, so he could just focus with his financial planning team. And I saw him use that term, "it's too soon," many times. It was very effective because it makes people step back and not push in and tell him, "Oh, this is good," or "the market's going to change. You have to grab this, or you have to do that." And he used that. He told me when I heard him again, he was a relative. When I heard him again say it, and I said, "Is it really still too soon?" He said, "Not really, but I really like it because then people don't bother me very much."
That's a good, protection mechanism, I think. And I also want to dive a little bit into both sides of the loss, right? There is the side of the person who has lost their loved one and now has to deal with a lot of change and a lot of figuring out of personal finances and things like that. And then there is obviously the person who passed. Sometimes depending on the situation, people do plan for this kind of thing. Lovaii, I remember you mentioning that, mortality is something that is important to talk about, right, with clients at whatever stage it feels most appropriate, but it's important to bring it up and actually face the realities of that. Can we also talk about both sides of the coin of also preparing for that, in this situation? Is that something that comes under the purview of, dealing with that as a transitionist?
Yes, it's very important. And I think it is common ground for all financial planners to have that kind of conversation and prepare a couple for the absence of one or the other. And it's nice if it's done with someone who really understands the emotional, the human side. So it's not just technical, the cash flow or the taxes and that sort of thing. So it certainly can be done. And even with all of that being in place, there still is a major transition going on. And you're right, it's on two sides. One, it is the person who is preparing to pass, and it's the person who's preparing and then will live on and have to adjust. So it's a very delicate space. There are people now in the States. We just had one sign up for our training to be a CEFT, and she is trained to work with people. That's called a death doula, to help people prepare for their passing, kind of what hospice would do, but apparently she has a different process. So helping someone with their ultimate transition, they're leaving this life, that's pretty big stuff. Most people are not trained in that. Planners are trained in the technical side of it. And we're all a little bit hesitant on the human side because it's an experience we all have. So it's good to normalize that, do the best that you can with that. But know that even if everything is in place, the surviving spouse still has a pretty tough time ahead of them for at least a couple of years.
To speak a little bit more about the surviving spouse, understanding, their predicament, understanding their situation. Like you said, I imagine that's a big part of the transitionist's journey as well, right? Because the needs will probably keep changing. At one time, it might seem suitable for them to do something, and then the next week they might have a change of heart. How do you confront that situation, right? When there is maybe constant change in a way that might be impulsive, again, because of the grieving process and things like that. Is that something you would suggest preparing for as an advisor? Or is it something you'd suggest going with the flow and, allowing it to happen, again, allowing space for that?
So one of the things that happens when, you've lost a loved one is there's suddenly a lot of advice that's coming to you from, friends, family, long lost relatives, etc. Some well-meaning, some may not be so well-meaning. And I think our role as transitionists is really to keep them safe and therefore try and see what is it that is really important, and the rest, we can wait and do what Susan's relative did. Maybe it's too soon, and make sure that they are not forced to take some decisions which they don't really need to take if there's not enough information, etc. And more importantly, I think there are some decisions that you would take which are irreversible. So if they are advised to say, oh, you've got this money from the insurance policy and you put it in a money market fund, that's fine. But if it says, oh, with this, you must go and buy another property and also do this and give so much to the child, then that's not something you're going to get back. So those are things that you need to sort of segregate and remind them that this is what you need to do. So while we talk about, slowing of pace, I think in certain cases, there may be a need to do it quickly because that's a safe thing for them to do. And if I can, I'll talk about a client who, it's a little tragic sort of story, but there's this couple who were both very ill during COVID. So about 3 years ago, the wife passed away while she was in the hospital. The husband was still in the hospital and had to do the rites. And at that stage, I think the son was 20 years old. The daughter was maybe 14. The son was studying abroad out of India. They were living in India. And, it took him a while to get back to work. And I know I met him last year and said, I met him at his workplace. He said, I come here because I need to get distracted and I'm getting some work to do, etc. And we used to talk to him about his investments, about his tax return. He said, that's something that I'll do later. As soon as you spoke about some of those things, he was tired to talk about them. And 2 months ago, when I was in fact in the US at this EFT conference, I got a message from a friend saying, this man passed away in his sleep. And, I told the advisor who was dealing with him, and she was like in a shock. And so the important thing is that we need to remove that personal grief that we are going through at that stage. So while we are wanting to be human in this situation, and luckily I had inputs and advice from some advisors in the US who have dealt with such situations, that no, this is the time you go and talk to the family, because the son is coming from the US. His brother, we figured, is coming from Singapore. His daughter is living there, but, and he has a really aging father who's 90. That's the survivor in his family. But this is the time when they are all going to be there. So better land up at their condolence meeting and tell them, I am the advisor. And, I understand this is not a great time. But, since one from Singapore, one from US is here, why don't we at least establish contact? We may talk about it later, but, I am the person to reach out to, etc., etc. And I think if we were not guided by this US advisor and their experience, we would have been extremely hesitant and reluctant, really, to talk about this with the family at this time. But, life happens, and then you have to move on, and you can say, I was being nice, I didn't reach out at that time, and then you figure out, I don't have an email ID, I don't have a number, I don't know whom to contact. So I think this role of dealing with loss of loved one, it can happen, with a aging parent, can happen with a younger parent, and you are at a very different stage. So a lot of these gives you insights to have conversations and keeping clients prepared as much as you can. I mean, there is a limit to which you can, go to push them to doing certain things, and some things you just have to leave it to them.
There's something you probably see too, and it's that too soon idea. There's the thought that grieving a spouse should take about a year, and then at the end of that year, you should make all your big decisions. To think somebody is going to be ready in a year is really not correct. It takes its own time. And it's something that we don't have an equation. We can't train clients to be ready at any particular time. The terms that are usually used are numbness, fatigue, I can't think straight, I can't remember. And when you hear things like this, that doesn't give you the signal that someone is ready to make decisions. So what we have found is that in the second year of grieving, that's actually the worst year. The first year, you're tired and numb, and you do the most basic, most important, urgent things. The second year, widows tell me that they feel like it's never going to end. It's always going to be this way. That pain, that ache is always going to be there. And it's a pretty dark time for some. And usually somewhere in the second year, they start to, what they say, come out of it. And widows are great talking to other widows. It's wonderful to have somebody who understands what's going on. And if you happen to not be a widow, you're their financial transitionist, you still have experience of other widows. So those first 2 years are tough. In fact, that's a very common time in the States. The data is 70% of widows leave their financial advisor in the second year. And the reason most frequently given is they don't feel heard. They don't feel understood. They need to go someplace where somebody, quote, gets them, and they can make decisions with confidence. They're too tired to move in the first year, and then they move on in the second year.
Now, that's a very revealing insight, actually, Susan. And I think, when it comes to a time like this that is so full of uncertainty, you can't find security in many places. The things that used to give you security are now suddenly gone, right? The safety aspect of things. So it is often in the idea of your finances that you can find safety. You can, to bring Lovai's idea of control back into it, you feel a bit more in control. So it's a valuable space to explore whenever, of course, one is ready to do so. But I again imagine that that's a big part of being a transitionist, is providing a space, of safety and security, not just by virtue of being there to listen to the person, but also in the practicality of providing, the safety net of finances to live a comfortable life moving forward. I think this has been a very revealing conversation, and there is so much to explore. Like you both said, every situation brings something new with it. But there are a couple of things when it comes to coping with the loss of a loved one, especially in your role as a transitionist, that can be applied across the board. So thank you for giving us insight into that. I'm sure it's very helpful for everyone listening today. Well, we've come to the end of this 3-part series. I do want to leave the floor open to the both of you as transitionists, right, to say maybe one thing that you would encourage people to explore this area of financial advisory. What would it be? And, we've explored the value of it, but what would you say is, why would you say it's so important to actually explore this area of advisory? Just maybe one thought to tie up the entire series.
Because it's the number one reason why the financial planning profession exists. People hire a financial planner to prepare for change, to manage it when it happens, and to adjust to that change after it has occurred. That's the main reason people hire financial planners. So we should be specialists in change and transition. It's a blind spot in the profession.
For me, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's a life skill. It just enables me to go through life far calmer and have a whole bunch of equipment and tools that I can use, and more importantly, a community of financial transitioners I can reach out to, saying, I'm facing this type of situation. Have you been through something like this before? And what did you do? What worked? What did not work? And I think it's extremely powerful, because at the end of the day, we can give all the advice we want. We want the clients to act on it. And I think that's very crucial, that we are able to handhold them, cajole them, push them into doing certain things which is in their interest, and keeping them safe all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I have to say absolutely to all of the valuable insights and information that has come through on this series. It's been extremely eye-opening, and I'm sure our listeners as well have had to ask themselves questions and ponder, right, on their own investment journeys and financial journeys, really. Thank you so much, Lovaii and Susan, for being with us and really taking us through something we don't often think about.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That brings us to the end of the series on financial transition here on Simply Lovaii, everybody. But stay tuned to the podcast series, because the expert with a heart, Lovaii Navlakhi, and I will be back. And we're going to kickstart another series on Simply Lovaii. This one about a topic, again, lesser known, lesser thought about, but important nonetheless. That seems to be the recurring theme. In the meantime, stay safe and stay happy, and of course, happy investing.
That was an episode of the Simply Lovaii podcast series, Expert with a Heart.